An oil heiress funded a revolution from her gilded mansion. This is the story of how one of America's wealthiest women turned her fortune into a weapon for change. And by the end, you will understand how private wealth can be used to reshape a nation. She was born into unimaginable luxury, yet she spent her life bankrolling a rebellion that terrified the men in power. How did a socialite become one of the most powerful forces in the fight for women's rights? What does it truly mean to use privilege as a tool for revolution? What would you be willing to sacrifice if you had the power to change the world? The foundation of her power was laid not with oil, but with steam and steel. The Vanderbilt name was synonymous with unprecedented wealth, a fortune so colossal it was almost impossible to comprehend. It all began with the patriarch Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who started with a single ferry boat in New York Harbor. Through ruthless ambition and shrewd business tactics, he built a sprawling empire of steamships that dominated the nation's waterways. Then he pivoted to the future, assembling a vast network of railroads that crisscrossed the continent, stitching the young nation together with iron tracks. This was the source of the fortune, a river of money flowing from transportation that would one day flow directly into Alva's hands. This inheritance was not merely a large bank account. It was a form of raw, unadulterated power. It gave Alva the one thing revolutionaries so often lack: the financial freedom to act without asking for permission. While other activists had to beg for donations, she could write a check that could fund an entire campaign, print thousands of pamphlets, or pay the legal fees for women arrested for protesting. Her wealth insulated her from the social and financial repercussions that silenced so many others. It was this bedrock of Vanderbilt gold, mined from the railroads of America, that provided the fuel for a very different kind of engine, one designed not for transport, but for total social change. But that river of Vanderbilt gold did not flow to Alva in its raw, industrial form. It first passed through the highly polished world of a Gilded Age childhood, a life of extraordinary privilege designed to prepare young women for one purpose: a brilliant marriage. Alva Smith was raised in the insular world of New York's ultra-wealthy, a society governed by an intricate and unyielding set of rules. Her days were filled with French lessons, piano practice, and fittings for extravagant gowns, all intended to mold her into the perfect ornament for a wealthy husband's drawing room. Yet even from within this gilded cage, Alva witnessed the stark inequalities that defined the era. From her carriage window, she saw the desperate poverty of the immigrant tenements just blocks away from her family's luxurious home. She observed the limited, often trivial, roles assigned to women of her own class, whose opinions on politics, business, or anything beyond the domestic sphere were dismissed as irrelevant. This constant juxtaposition, the obscene wealth beside the grinding poverty, the rigid expectations beside her own burgeoning intellect, planted a deep and lasting seed of discontent. How could a society be so advanced and yet so profoundly unfair? Why were the minds of women considered less valuable than their family connections? These were the quiet, burning questions that formed in Alva's youth, long before she had the power to demand answers. That early exposure to social injustice, viewed from the velvet-lined confines of her privileged world, did not make her complacent. It made her a revolutionary in waiting. The path from a discontented young woman to a revolutionary force required a platform, and for Alva Smith, that platform was built through a meticulously calculated union. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the formidable Cornelius, in a move that was less a romantic fairy tale and more a corporate merger of two colossal fortunes. Their wedding was a spectacle of Gilded Age opulence, a public declaration of the Smith and Vanderbilt families cementing their power. As Mrs. Vanderbilt, Alva was suddenly at the very pinnacle of New York society, a world defined by its extravagant excess. She presided over a Fifth Avenue mansion that was more a French chateau than a home, complete with gilded ballrooms and art collections that rivaled national museums. Her life became a whirlwind of lavish parties, European tours, and the constant acquisition of priceless jewels and custom-made gowns. On the surface, she was the ultimate society wife, fulfilling every expectation placed upon a woman of her station. Yet this life of unparalleled luxury was, for Alva, a means to an end. She was not just spending the Vanderbilt fortune, she was studying it, understanding its sheer scale and its potential as an instrument of influence. The very society that celebrated her for her wealth and her husband's name was the same one that denied her the right to vote, to own property independently, or to have a voice in public life. She lived this paradox every single day, surrounded by unimaginable privilege, yet legally and socially powerless. How long could a woman of such formidable will and intellect play the role of a decorative accessory? The gilded cage was now lined with Vanderbilt velvet, but for Alva, it was still a cage, and she was already looking for the key. That key was not a delicate instrument, but a sledgehammer made of Indiana limestone and French Renaissance grandeur. Alva Vanderbilt declared war on the stuffy traditions of old New York society, not with words, but with architecture. Her weapon was a mansion, the now legendary Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue. This was not merely a home. It was a statement carved in stone, a deliberate and shocking challenge to the faded brownstones of the established elite. She hired the most sought-after architect of the day, Richard Morris Hunt, and gave him a simple, revolutionary directive: build me a palace that no one can ignore. And so he did, creating a breathtaking confection of turrets, ornate carvings, and gleaming white stone that looked as if it had been transported directly from the War Valley and dropped onto a New York City street. For the old money families who traced their lineage back to the Dutch settlers, this flamboyant display was vulgar, a garish proclamation of new money. But Alva did not care about their whispered criticisms. She understood that in the Gilded Age, perception was power, and she was building a throne. The true masterstroke, however, was not the house itself, but how she used it. Once the final stone was laid, Alva planned her most audacious move yet: a costume ball that would become the stuff of New York legend. This was not just a party, it was a meticulously orchestrated social siege. She sent out lavish invitations, and the entire city waited to see if the old guard, the Astors in particular, would deign to attend the Vanderbilt upstart. The legendary Carolina Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, initially refused. In her world, one was introduced to society. One did not buy one's way in with a French shadow. But Alva, with cold, strategic brilliance, let it be known that Mrs. Astore's own daughter, Carrie, would not receive an invitation unless her mother acknowledged the Vanderbilts. It was a checkmate in silk and diamonds. Faced with the social ruin of her own daughter, Caroline Astor was forced to pay a formal visit to the Petit Chateau, a surrender that was witnessed and discussed across the city. On the night of the ball, Alva triumphed, dressed as a Venetian princess, presiding over a spectacle of such opulence that it shattered the old social order forever. She had not asked for entry. She had purchased the building and then stormed the gates. In a single evening, she established herself as a dominant, unignorable social force. But why would a woman with a growing resentment for this very system work so hard to conquer it? Because Alva knew that to change the rules, you first must own the game. And now the board was hers. Conquering New York society was merely the first battle in a much larger war. The throne Alva had built for herself within the Vanderbilt dynasty soon became a prison she could no longer tolerate. Her marriage to William Kissam Vanderbilt, the foundation of her social power, began to crumble under the weight of his very public infidelity. In the Gilded Age, for a man of his standing, such affairs were often quietly accepted as an unfortunate privilege of wealth and power. Wives were expected to look the other way, to preserve the facade of a happy union for the sake of family reputation and financial stability. But Alva was not a woman who looked the other way. The discovery of William's affair was the final, shattering blow to a relationship already strained by her growing independence and his more traditional expectations. She made a decision that sent tremors through the foundations of high society, a decision that was almost unthinkable for a woman in her position. She would not pretend. She would not endure. She would sue for divorce. The announcement was a social earthquake. This was not just a private matter, it was front-page news. For the first time, one of the wealthiest, most visible women in America was publicly rejecting the terms of her gilded cage and demanding her freedom. The scandal was immense. Alva was vilified in many quarters, accused of being ungrateful, hysterical, and of threatening the very institution of marriage. But she wielded her social power like a shield. She leveraged the very notoriety she had cultivated, using the public's fascination with the Vanderbilts to control the narrative. In a stunning and strategic move, she did not just secure her divorce. She secured an unprecedented settlement, a fortune of her own that was completely separate from her former husband's control. This was not merely a legal separation. It was a personal declaration of independence. By walking away from the Vanderbilt name and taking a massive piece of its fortune with her, Alva demonstrated a terrifying truth to the powerful men of her era. A woman with her own money could not be controlled. She had used the system's own rules, the laws of property and scandal, to emancipate herself. This divorce was her first true public revolution, a rebellion fought not in the streets, but in the drawing rooms and courtrooms of high society. And it proved that her wealth was not just for building palaces, but for dismantling the very structures that confined her. What would she build with her newfound freedom? And who would she become now that she was truly, undeniably, her own woman? Freedom, however, can be a lonely country. Alva Vanderbilt, now one of the world's richest and most notorious divorcees, had achieved financial independence, but she was not a woman built for solitude. She needed a partner, not a patriarch, an ally in her ambitions rather than an opponent to her will. She found this in a most unexpected place, with a man who was already a close family friend, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. Oliver was not just another wealthy scion. He was the son of the powerful August Belmont and a man of considerable intellect and progressive leanings. Their courtship was swift, a quiet understanding between two people who recognized in each other a kindred spirit. They married in a simple, almost subdued ceremony, a stark contrast to the spectacular opulence of her first wedding. This was not a corporate merger of fortunes. It was a meeting of minds. Oliver Belmont shared Alva's growing interest in social reform, and crucially, he did not see her formidable intellect as a threat. He admired her passion and her drive, offering not just his name, but his unwavering support. He provided her with the emotional stability and intellectual companionship that her first marriage had so painfully lacked. Their home, Belcourt Castle in Newport, became a different kind of salon, not just a showcase for wealth, but a gathering place for thinkers, writers, and early advocates for social change. Here, Alva could freely debate ideas that were still considered radical in polite society. Oliver did not stand in her shadow. He stood beside her, his own social standing and wealth providing a protective shield that allowed Alva's activism to flourish without the same level of social censure she might have faced alone. This second marriage was the final piece of her personal transformation. She was no longer just Alva the social climber, or Alva the scandalous divorcee. She was now Alva Belmont, a woman with a devoted partner, a colossal fortune entirely under her own control, and a burning desire to turn her private convictions into public action. The stage was finally set, and the revolutionary was ready for her cause. The cause found her not in a public square, but in the quiet confines of her own library. While Alva Belmont was enjoying the stability of her second marriage, a pamphlet or a newspaper article likely crossed her desk. Its arguments so electrifying, they seemed to illuminate the page. It was the philosophy of the women's suffrage movement, a logical, undeniable case for equality that put words to the discontent she had felt since her girlhood. For the first time, she saw her lifelong frustration not as a personal failing, but as a political condition shared by millions. The key figures who shaped her understanding were women like Anna Howard Shaw, a powerful orator and physician, and the formidable Carrie Chapman Catt, a master strategist whose organizational genius was building a national movement. These were not society women asking politely for change. They were generals in a war for the soul of the nation. Through their writings and speeches, Alva experienced a profound awakening. Every slight she had endured, every time her opinion was dismissed because of her gender, every legal constraint that had chafed against her spirit, now had a name and a solution. The vote was not just a ballot. It was the fundamental key to personhood, the tool that would force society to recognize women as full and equal citizens. And in that moment of clarity, Alva Belmont realized she held two weapons of immense power that these brave activists desperately lacked. The first was her colossal fortune. She could fund entire campaigns, print millions of pieces of literature, rent headquarters, and pay organizers, freeing the movement from the constant, draining burden of fundraising. The second, just as crucial, was her unassailable social position. She was a Vanderbilt by first marriage and a Belmont by the second, a name that commanded headlines and opened doors no ordinary activist could ever approach. She could host a suffrage rally in a Newport ballroom that the press would be forced to cover. She could lobby politicians who would otherwise refuse a meeting. She could make the fight for the vote fashionable, respectable, even glamorous. Her wealth and status, once tools for personal conquest, were now officially conscripted into a much larger army. The revolutionary had found her revolution, and she was prepared to bankroll its victory. Alva Belmont's checkbook became her declaration of war. She understood with brutal clarity that in a society built on money, political change required a financial engine. While other suffragists passionately argued for justice, Alva provided the machinery to make that argument inescapable. She consciously transformed her personal fortune into a permanent war chest for the revolution, funding the fight with a scale and strategy that left even her allies in awe. Her philosophy was simple, yet radical for its time. She believed that financial power was not just a luxury, it was the essential prerequisite for gaining political power. Without economic independence, women would always be beholden to the very system that oppressed them. How could you demand equality from a government if you could not even fund your own campaign to be heard? She once stated that the only way to get justice was to buy it, a stark and pragmatic view forged in the fire of Gilded Age capitalism. This was not charity. It was a calculated, strategic investment in liberation. She paid for everything, from the printing of millions of pamphlets that flooded the nation to the salaries of full-time organizers who could dedicate their lives to the cause without fear of poverty. She rented entire office buildings to serve as national headquarters, creating a professional, centralized command post for the movement. When suffragists were arrested for peaceful protest, Alva's money posted their bail and hired the best lawyers to defend them, turning the courtrooms into stages for their arguments. She funded parades so massive they shut down entire cities, forcing the public and the press to visually comprehend the sheer number of women demanding the vote. Every dollar was a bullet aimed at the status quo. She was not merely a donor, she was a general, and her wealth was the army she deployed across the country. This was a new kind of warfare, fought not with rifles, but with resources, and Alva Belmont ensured her side would never run out of ammunition. The money flowed directly into the heart of the movement. Alva Belmont made the National American Woman Suffrage Association her primary financial beneficiary, transforming the organization from a passionate but perpetually underfunded crusade into a professional political machine. Her checks were not small donations. They were monumental transfers of capital that funded the entire anatomy of a national campaign. She paid the salaries of full-time lobbyists who could buttonhole politicians in Washington, day after day, arguing the case for the vote with relentless, well-funded persistence. She financed fleets of printing presses, which ran day and night to produce millions of pamphlets, leaflets, and posters, ensuring the suffragist message blanketed the country from small farming towns to crowded industrial cities. When a brilliant speaker like Anna Howard Shaw needed to travel the nation, it was often Alva's money that covered the train tickets, the hotel rooms, and the rental fees for the auditoriums where she would sway thousands with her powerful oratory. This was not a matter of writing one large check and stepping back. It was a continuous strategic infusion of cash that allowed the NAWSA to plan for the long term, to think bigger, and to fight harder. How do you sustain a revolution? You fund its payroll, you print its arguments, and you amplify its most powerful voices. Alva Belmont understood that political change required a permanent professional infrastructure, and she single-handedly provided it. The fight for the ballot was no longer a grassroots protest. It was a corporate-scale operation, and she was its chief executive officer. But a national campaign also needed a physical headquarters, a command center where strategy could be forged away from the public eye. Alva Belmont found this fortress in the most unlikely of places, her own summer palace in Newport, the infamous Marble House. This monument to Gilded Age excess, a blindingly white mansion constructed from untold tons of Italian marble, had been a wedding present from her first husband, William Vanderbilt. It was a temple to the very system of wealth and patriarchy she now sought to dismantle. And so, with a sense of poetic justice, she decided to turn it into a war room. The gilded ballrooms, once filled with the idle chatter of society elites, now echoed with the passionate debates of suffragist leaders. In the grand dining hall, beneath crystal chandeliers, Alva hosted intense strategy sessions with women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw. They spread maps and legislative charts across the polished tables, plotting their next moves in state-by-state battles for the vote. This was not a subtle repurposing. It was a deliberate occupation. A Marble House became the site of fundraising galas unlike any Newport had ever seen. The same socialites who had once gossiped about Alva's divorce now found themselves invited to lavish luncheons, only to be presented with a compelling case for women's suffrage and a discreet, yet firm, request for a substantial donation. The most shocking transformation, however, occurred on the mansion's sprawling terrace overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Alva erected a large, ornate Chinese tea house, a whimsical structure that became a platform for radical speeches. Here, in the very heart of America's most exclusive enclave, orators stood before audiences of wealthy women and declared that the entire political system was unjust and must be overturned. The spectacle was jarring, the clash of worlds almost unbelievable. To see a woman stand in a place that symbolized ultimate privilege and preach revolution left high society both mesmerized and horrified. Alva had taken a symbol of her own oppression and weaponized it, using its grandeur to legitimize the cause and its seclusion to protect its most audacious plans. If money was her army, then Marble House was the fortress from which she launched every attack. Yet that very fortress, Marble House, soon became a symbol of a deep and growing conflict. From her Newport command center, Alva Belmont began to chafe at the cautious, incremental strategy championed by the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Its leadership, particularly the pragmatic Carrie Chapman Catt, believed in a state-by-state approach, winning the vote one legislature at a time. This method was slow, expensive, and often resulted in heartbreaking defeats after years of grueling work. For Alva, a woman accustomed to building palaces in a matter of months, this glacial pace was unacceptable. She saw it as a form of compromise with a system that did not deserve compromise. Why beg for rights piecemeal from the very politicians who denied them? Her philosophy, forged in the fires of her own personal rebellions, was far more direct. She believed in confrontation, in creating a public spectacle so powerful that the federal government would be forced to act. The vote was a national right, and it required a national battle fought not in state capitals, but on the doorstep of the United States Congress. This fundamental disagreement over tactics created an irreconcilable rift between the movement's primary financier and its established leadership. Alva was not just donating money, she was demanding a revolution, and she grew impatient with what she viewed as a political campaign. So she made the most dramatic decision of her activist career. She withdrew her immense financial support from the NAWS and cut ties with the organization she had once bankrolled so completely. It was a stunning blow, a schism that sent shockwaves through the entire suffrage movement. But Alva Belmont was not retreating from the fight. She was simply redeploying her forces for a more radical war. Her departure from the established movement was not a surrender, but a redeployment. Alva Belmont now poured her fortune and her formidable will into a new militant organization, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, founded with the fiery young activists Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. This was not just a new group, it was a declaration of a new kind of war. While the old guard lobbied state legislatures, Alva, Alice, and Lucy set their sights on a single federal target: the President of the United States and the political party that kept him in power. Their strategy was brilliantly simple and utterly confrontational. They would hold the party in power, the Democrats, led by President Woodrow Wilson, directly accountable for its failure to pass a national suffrage amendment. Why should women support a party that denied them a voice? This was a radical shift in political thinking. Instead of politely asking for change, the Congressional Union would demand it, using public pressure as their primary weapon. Alice Paul, a master of political theater, organized silent daily pickets outside the White House. These were not rowdy protests, but solemn, powerful vigils. Women stood in silence, holding banners that quoted the president's own lofty words about democracy, forcing him to confront his own hypocrisy every time he left the gates. Alva Belmont funded it all. She paid for the trains that brought picketers to Washington. She financed the printing of those piercing banners. And most crucially, she provided the legal defense fund when those peaceful protesters were arrested, as they soon were, in droves. The spectacle of respectable women, including socialites from Alva's own circle, being hauled off to prison for asking for the vote, created a public relations nightmare for the Wilson administration. The battle was no longer hidden in state houses or drawing rooms. It was unfolding on Pennsylvania Avenue, and Alva Belmont's money ensured the world was watching. The silent protests outside the White House gates were a masterpiece of political theater, and Alva Belmont's fortune was the unseen director. Her checks ensured the National Woman's Party could sustain its most radical and visible campaign, the Silent Sentinel. Day after day, in blistering heat and freezing cold, women stood motionless, holding banners that shamed President Wilson with his own words about democracy and freedom. This was not a spontaneous demonstration. It was a meticulously funded operation. Alva paid for the banners themselves, crafted from durable silk to withstand the elements and the occasional violent tear from angry bystanders. She covered the travel expenses for women who journeyed from across the country, to take their turn on the picket line, providing them with meals and warm clothing. This financial backing meant that the protests could be perpetual, an unending, silent rebuke that the president and his staff could not ignore. But the true test of her commitment came when the government retaliated. Police began arresting the protesters on charges like obstructing sidewalk traffic. When these peaceful women were sentenced to prison, Alva's money followed them behind bars. She hired the most skilled attorneys to fight their cases and provided funds for their families while they were incarcerated. She ensured that no suffragist would face the horrors of the Occoquan workhouse, alone or without legal recourse. This comprehensive support system was revolutionary. It meant that activists could risk arrest without facing financial ruin for their families, transforming imprisonment from a deterrent into a powerful propaganda tool. How do you sustain a protest that lasts for months, even years? You fund its logistics, its legal defense, and the well-being of its foot soldiers. Alva Belmont turned the act of civil disobedience into a sustainable, professional campaign, proving that her revolution could be bankrolled. That silent, dignified protest on the White House sidewalk was met with escalating violence. The government's response culminated in a single, horrifying night that would sear itself into the nation's conscience, the Night of Terror. On November 14, 1917, the superintendent of the Occoquan workhouse unleashed his guards upon the imprisoned suffragists in a calculated act of brutality. They beat, choked, and dragged the women, targeting the most prominent leaders with particular savagery. One elderly protester, Lucy Burns, was handcuffed with her arms above her head to the bars of her cell door and left all night in agony. Another, Dora Lewis, was thrown so violently into a cell that her head struck the iron bed, and for a time her companions believed she was dead. The goal was to break their spirits, to force them to abandon their cause through sheer terror. But the guards made a fatal miscalculation. They had targeted women who were not only brave, but who were also backed by a financier who knew exactly how to weaponize their suffering. Alva Belmont's network swung into immediate action. Her money paid for lawyers who secured meetings with officials and for publicists who ensured that the victims' detailed, first-hand accounts of the beatings did not remain locked within the prison walls. These testimonies were smuggled out and sent directly to sympathetic newspapers. The story exploded onto front pages across the country, the graphic descriptions of the Night of Terror shocking a public that had been largely indifferent to the suffragists' arrests. How could the American government, which was fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy, be brutally beating its own citizens for peacefully demanding their democratic rights? The public sympathy that the movement had struggled for years to build now surged overnight. Alva's funding had turned a secret atrocity into a national scandal, transforming the imprisoned suffragists from lawbreakers into political martyrs. The violence meant to silence them had instead given their cause a powerful, unstoppable voice. While the silent sentinels made headlines with their silent suffering, Alva Belmont was funding a second, equally vital front in the war for the vote, the battle for public opinion. She understood that changing laws required first changing minds, and she transformed her fortune into a propaganda machine of breathtaking scale. The most potent weapon in this arsenal was a newspaper, The Suffragist, published weekly by Alice Paul's National Woman's Party. Alva's money kept the presses running, ensuring that every week a sharp, intelligent, and unapologetic voice for the militant movement landed on doorsteps and in newsstands across the nation. The Suffragist was not a meek newsletter, it was a strategic bulletin. It reported on the White House pickets, published the shocking accounts from the Occoquan workhouse, and framed the struggle not as a request, but as a moral imperative. It gave the movement a cohesive narrative and a direct line to its supporters, all funded by Alva's unwavering checks. But her vision for propaganda extended far beyond a single publication. She financed the printing of millions of pamphlets, leaflets, and posters, turning abstract arguments for equality into simple, digestible messages that could be understood by anyone. These were not dry political tracts. They were powerful visual tools. They featured stirring illustrations of women as liberty-bearing goddesses and pointed cartoons that mocked the hypocrisy of anti-suffrage politicians. How do you convince a nation? You blanket it with your message. Alva paid for organizers to distribute this literature at factory gates, in church halls, and on busy city street corners, ensuring the suffragist argument reached every level of society, from the industrial worker to the rural farmer. This constant nationwide drumbeat of information, all paid for by one woman's fortune, created a cultural climate where the idea of women voting shifted from a radical fantasy to an inevitable reality. The war was not just fought with silent protests, but with a deafening roar of printed words, and Alva Belmont made certain that roar would be heard in every corner of America. The pressure on the White House was relentless, a siege funded with Vanderbilt gold and Belmont determination. Alva's money did not just support the silent pickets. It financed an entire ecosystem of political pressure designed to make President Wilson's life unbearable until he capitulated. Her fortune paid for cross-country speaking tours, where fiery orators from the National Woman's Party would travel from city to city, whipping up public support and shining a spotlight on the president's inaction. These were not cheap affairs. They required train tickets, hotel accommodations, and rented auditoriums, all meticulously covered by Alva's checks. The goal was to create a groundswell of discontent that Wilson could not ignore, no matter where he looked. But the lobbying went far beyond public speeches. Alva funded delegations of women, carefully selected for their respectability and persuasive power, to secure meetings with senators and congressmen. These were not casual chats. They were professional lobbying sessions, with women armed with data, arguments, and the unspoken but ever-present knowledge that the formidable Alva Belmont was bankrolling their entire operation. They would sit in polished mahogany offices and calmly, firmly present their case, making it clear that the political cost of denying the vote was becoming higher than the cost of granting it. How do you change a politician's mind? You make inaction more painful than action. Alva's wealth created a constant, inescapable drumbeat of demand, a symphony of pressure played on every available instrument, from the silent vigil on the sidewalk to the roaring crowds in distant cities, all reminding the most powerful man in the country that half the nation was still waiting for its voice. The relentless pressure finally cracked the political dam. In January of 1919, with the war in Europe over and the nation weary of conflict, Congress at last passed the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote. But the battle was only half won. The amendment now had to be ratified by 36 of the then 48 state legislatures, a gauntlet of political maneuvering and entrenched opposition. This final, grueling sprint for ratification became a frantic race against time and reactionary forces. And once again, Alva Belmont's fortune became the movement's fuel. She understood that momentum was everything, and that the public needed to see the human cost of the struggle to maintain its sympathy. So she funded one of the most audacious publicity campaigns in American political history, the Prison Special Tour. A train car was chartered, filled with women who had been imprisoned and brutalized at the Occoquan workhouse. These were not anonymous activists. They were well-spoken, respectable women, many from influential families, who now carried the scars of their government's brutality. Dressed in replicas of their prison uniforms, they traveled from city to city, standing on platforms and describing, in chilling detail, the night of terror and their harrowing experiences behind bars. Alva paid for the train, the venues, the advertisements, and the pamphlets that surrounded each event. The Prison Special was a rolling theater of martyrdom, forcing audiences to look directly at the price women had paid for a simple ballot. It transformed abstract suffragists into daughters, sisters, and mothers who had suffered for a principle. And it shamed the nation into recognizing the justness of their cause. How do you win a war of public opinion? You show the wounds, and Alva Belmont ensured the whole country saw them. Yet this national spectacle was only one front. The real state-by-state trench warfare of ratification demanded a different kind of funding, and Alva's checkbook was open for that, too. In states like Tennessee, which would become the dramatic final battleground, the fight came down to lobbying individual lawmakers. Anti-suffragists, often backed by powerful business interests, plied legislators with liquor, fancy meals, and whispered promises. The suffragists had to fight back with organization and persistence, and that required money. Alva's funds paid for organizers on the ground, for telegrams to sway key votes, for last-minute travel for influential speakers, and for rooms at the hotel where the political wrangling reached a fever pitch. Her money ensured that the pro-suffrage forces could match the opposition's resources, dollar for dollar, in a brutal political brawl. When the final, dramatic vote in the Tennessee legislature hung by a single vote, that of a young legislator named Harry Byrne, it was a letter from his mother in his pocket that famously swayed him. But it was the suffragist lobbyists, funded and sustained by patrons like Alva Belmont, who had created the political environment where such a personal plea could carry the day. They had spent years and a fortune making the vote for suffrage the politically tenable choice. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was not a sudden gift. It was a victory purchased through strategic investment in public sentiment and raw political power. Alva Belmont had proven that a revolution could, in fact, be funded, and that a woman with a fortune and a cause could help bend the arc of history itself. What does a revolutionary do when her revolution is finally won? The vote was a monumental victory, but for Alva Belmont, it was never the final destination. It was a single, crucial key that could now unlock other doors. Her revolutionary vision extended far beyond the ballot box, encompassing the entire landscape of social and economic inequality. With the 19th Amendment secured, she immediately redirected her fortune and her ferocious energy toward a much broader fight, the fight for women's full and equal participation in society. She understood that the right to vote meant little, if women remained economically dependent and educationally stunted. Her next great cause was the labor movement, particularly the plight of working women. She shocked her high society peers by publicly siding with striking garment workers, women laboring in horrific conditions for starvation wages. She used her Newport mansion to host fundraising events for their unions, and her checkbook paid for their legal defense and strike funds. To a world that saw her as a pampered socialite, her solidarity with the working class seemed a bizarre contradiction. But for Alva, the logic was simple and unshakable. How could women be free citizens if they were not free from economic exploitation? She saw the fight for a living wage and safe working conditions as the natural extension of the fight for the vote. Both were battles for a woman's right to control her own life. Her activism did not stop at the national border. She became a major financial backer of the International Woman Suffrage Alliance, funding conferences and publications that connected the American struggle to a global feminist network. She believed that the subjugation of women was a worldwide problem requiring a worldwide movement, and her wealth helped build the bridges between activists in Europe, the Americas, and beyond. But perhaps her most enduring legacy beyond suffrage was her passionate advocacy for education. She funded scholarships for women at prestigious universities and donated vast sums to institutions like Barnard College, creating pathways for generations of women to enter the professions, to become doctors, lawyers, scientists, and scholars. She knew that knowledge was its own form of power, a currency that could not be taken away. For Alva Belmont, the revolution was never a single battle to be won. It was a continuous campaign for a more just world, fought with every tool at her disposal, from the factory floor to the university lecture hall. The woman who had bought her own freedom now sought to purchase a freer future for all women. Beacon Towers rose from the Long Island shoreline not as a home, but as a final, definitive statement. After a lifetime of conquering social worlds and bankrolling political revolutions, Alva Belmont turned her immense energy inward, commissioning a personal fortress that was the purest expression of her powerful will. This was not another French chateau built to impress New York society, nor a marble palace symbolizing a gilded marriage. Beacon Towers was a sprawling, medieval-style castle of rough-hewn stone, complete with turrets, a drawbridge, and a great hall worthy of a queen. It looked less like a residence and more like a stronghold, a place designed to withstand a siege, and in a way, it was. This was the home she built entirely for herself, a monument to the independent kingdom she had carved out of a world that had once tried to confine her. Every crenellation, every arrow-slit window spoke of a woman who had learned to be her own sovereign. How do you visually represent a life of defiance? You build a castle and you place yourself firmly on the throne. The interior was a curated collection of her life's battles and triumphs. Tapestries depicting Joan of Arc, a personal heroine who represented visionary leadership and martyrdom for a cause, hung alongside portraits of suffrage leaders. The grand spaces were filled with artifacts from her travels and mementos from the long fight for the vote. Each room a chapter in her own epic story. Beacon Towers had no need for a husband's study or a ballroom for society's approval. It was designed around the needs and desires of one person, its sole ruler. Here, Alva could look out from her tower across the Atlantic, a literal beacon of what a woman could achieve when she wielded her own fortune and her own ferocious intellect without apology. It was her final and most personal act of architecture, a fortress built not from a blueprint of tradition, but from the raw materials of a revolutionary spirit. Her revolutionary triumphs cast long and complicated shadows over her private life. For all the freedom Alva fought for in the public sphere, she wielded absolute control within the walls of her own home, and the greatest casualty of this contradiction was her eldest daughter, Consuelo. From the moment of her birth, Consuelo was treated not as a child, but as a political and social asset, a princess to be bartered for the ultimate prize, a royal title. Alva, the woman who had broken free from one gilded cage, methodically constructed another for her own daughter, enforcing a brutal regime of education and discipline designed to mold Consuelo into the perfect duchess. The girl was kept isolated from society, her every movement monitored, her friendships dictated by their potential for social advantage. When Consuelo, at 17, fell in love with a respectable American suitor, Alva responded not as a mother, but as a general facing a mutiny. She forbade the match, and when Consuelo resisted, Alva allegedly took to her sick, declaring that her daughter's disobedience would be the death of her. Faced with this emotional blackmail, Consuelo finally surrendered. The wedding to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was one of the most spectacular and sorrowful events of the Gilded Age. The bride wept openly behind her veil, a stark contrast to the triumphant gleam in her mother's eyes. Alva had achieved her ambition, securing a ducal coronet for the Vanderbilt line, but she had purchased it with her daughter's happiness. This calculated transaction would forever fracture their relationship, creating a chasm of resentment that no amount of time or public victory could ever fully bridge. How could the architect of women's liberation be the same person who orchestrated such a personal imprisonment? The question haunted Alva for the rest of her life, a painful reminder that even revolutionaries are prisoners of their own blind spots. The scorn she faced was not only familial, but social. The very peers whose world she had once conquered now turned on her with vicious intensity. The woman who had made suffrage fashionable now found herself utterly unfashionable. Once cordial doors in Newport, in New York, were slammed shut. She was caricatured in the press as a hysterical, man-hating shrew, a traitor to her class. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking with her, their whispers of disapproval a constant, humiliating soundtrack. They saw her activism not as a moral crusade, but as a profound betrayal, an ungrateful bite on the hand that had fed her a life of luxury. The funding that flowed so freely to the revolution came at the price of her own social annihilation. She traded the warm, if shallow, acceptance of high society for the cold, hard benches of a protest line. Yet, in a strange way, this total ostracization may have been the final liberation Alva needed. Stripped of all social obligations and the need to conform, she was free to become her truest, most formidable self, answerable to no one but her own conscience and the cause she served so fiercely. The personal cost was staggering, but for Alva Belmont, the freedom to fight for millions of women was worth the loss of a single, gilded world. Her immense power came with profound contradictions that could not be ignored. For all her revolutionary zeal, Alva Belmont was often described as an autocrat, a general who demanded absolute loyalty from the troops she funded. She did not simply write checks, she dictated strategy, and her forceful personality frequently clashed with other strong-willed leaders in the movement. Her partnership with Alice Paul, while effective, was famously tense. Alva expected her financial contributions to translate into direct control over the National Woman's Party's decisions, and she had little patience for collaborative debate. This top-down leadership style, mirroring the industrial barons she descended from, sometimes alienated the very activists she sought to empower. How could a movement dedicated to democratic participation be led so undemocratically? The question lingered in the strained meetings and private correspondence of the suffrage fight. Further complicating her legacy was the stark reality of her position. She was a woman of almost unimaginable wealth, leading a crusade for universal equality. This inherent paradox did not escape her critics, both inside and outside the movement. Some working-class suffragists, while grateful for her money, quietly resented her occasional displays of condescension. They noted how her activism, for all its power, was often framed within the context of her own privileged world. Her grand rallies at Marble House, while strategically brilliant, also highlighted the vast class divide between the financier and the factory worker she aimed to liberate. There was an undeniable irony in a woman who owned multiple castles, arguing for the rights of women who could not afford a single safe apartment. Was she truly fighting for all women, or was she primarily advancing a vision of equality that conveniently placed women of her own class and intellect at the helm? Her belief in equality was genuine, but it was sometimes filtered through a lens of aristocratic privilege, a conviction that she and her wealthy, educated peers were naturally best suited to lead the charge. This classism created a subtle barrier, a reminder that the revolution was being bankrolled by someone who had never known a day of financial insecurity in her life. Yet, to dismiss her contributions because of her wealth would be to misunderstand the nature of her revolution. Alva herself would have argued that her fortune was not a mark of hypocrisy, but her primary weapon. She was using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, turning the very symbol of patriarchal power, inherited wealth, against the system that created it. She never pretended to be a common woman, but she leveraged her uncommon position to create change on a common scale. The money that built marble ballrooms also printed the pamphlets that educated millions and paid the bail for the working-class women arrested beside her. Her story forces us to ask a difficult question. Can a flawed vessel still carry a pure cause? Can a revolution be both authentically radical and funded by the very elite it seeks to challenge? Alva Belmont's life stands as a powerful, complicated yes. Alva Belmont's blueprint for revolution did not vanish with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Her strategy of deploying private wealth as a political weapon established a template that echoes powerfully in modern activism. Today, we see her direct descendants not in bloodline, but in methodology, in the philanthropists and organizers who understand that profound social change requires a financial war chest. Alva demonstrated that a movement could be professionalized, that it needed full-time lobbyists, legal defense funds, and a relentless media presence to succeed. She turned activism from a passion project into a sustainable operation. This model is now standard practice. Consider the network of organizations advocating for climate action or racial justice, many of which are backed by significant private donations from individuals and foundations. These modern benefactors, much like Alva, provide the stable funding for everything from policy, research, and grassroots organizing to digital advertising and legal challenges. They are not merely donors. They are strategic investors in social transformation, funding the infrastructure of change over the long term. How does a movement gain traction in a crowded digital age? It requires a professional staff, data analysts, and lawyers, all of which depend on the kind of consistent, substantial funding Alva pioneered. Her greatest legacy, however, may be her fearless embrace of controversy. She proved that making people uncomfortable was not a side effect of progress. It was the engine. Modern activist groups, unafraid to use confrontation and political pressure to hold power accountable, walk a path she boldly cleared. The picket lines have moved from Pennsylvania Avenue to social media feeds and corporate headquarters, but the principle remains the same: sustained, well-funded pressure can bend the arc of history. Alva Belmont's life asks a final, enduring question of us all. If you possess power, whether it is wealth, influence, or simply a voice, what is your responsibility to use it in the service of a more just world? Her story is the ultimate paradox of power. Alva Belmont began her life as a prized ornament in the gilded cage of high society, trained for a singular purpose: to be the perfect wife. Yet she ended it as one of the most effective revolutionaries of her age, a woman who systematically used the tools of the elite to smash the very foundations of that elite's power. She took the Vanderbilt fortune, a monument to patriarchal capitalism, and transformed it into the lifeblood of a movement dedicated to dismantling that same system. Her journey was not a straight line from socialite to saint. It was a complex, often contradictory, march from one battlefield to another. She conquered society not to join it, but to command its attention. She endured a scandalous divorce not for personal vengeance, but to secure the financial independence that would make her untouchable. And then, with her fortune and her freedom firmly in her grasp, she declared war on the political establishment that denied half the population a voice. Her checkbook was her sword, and she wielded it with the precision of a master strategist, funding the printing presses, the lawyers, the lobbyists, and the protests that slowly, inexorably, forced America to live up to its own ideals. She did not simply donate to a cause. She bankrolled an entire ecosystem of rebellion, proving that in a society built on money, true change requires a financial revolution. Her legacy forces us to confront a difficult truth about privilege. She could have lived a life of quiet luxury, hosting parties while the world burned with injustice just outside her mansion gates. Instead, she chose to use her unimaginable wealth as a lever, prying open the doors of democracy for generations of women to come. Her life stands as a permanent challenge, a question whispered down through the decades. What do you do with the power you are given? Do you build higher walls to protect your own comfort? Or do you use it to build a door for everyone else to walk through? Alva Belmont's life remains a profound puzzle. The revolutionary heiress who wielded her privilege as a weapon against the very system that granted it. She forces us to reconsider the relationship between immense resources and righteous rebellion, proving that the tools of oppression can, in the right hands, become instruments of liberation. Her story is not a simple fable of a saintly benefactor, but a complex blueprint for how power, even when born from inequality, can be redirected toward the pursuit of a more equitable world. She challenges us to look at our own positions, our own spheres of influence, no matter how large or small. We all possess some form of currency, whether it is time, skill, platform, or capital. The enduring question her legacy poses is not whether you have power, but what you choose to build with it. Will you fortify the walls around you, or will you help dismantle them for everyone? In the comments, we would love to hear your thoughts. Which modern figure, using their wealth or influence to drive social change, most reminds you of Alva Belmont?